Well, I'm going to take up a little bit where John Lombardi left off. In fact, I used some of his data to do this. I was at a dinner party Friday night down in Mission Viejo. There were 10 adults there. They asked me why I was here, and I explained about the meeting a little bit. And all 10 of them proceeded to tell me why they're very angry about the cost of higher education. And it has to be fixed from their point of view. We talked about the higher education bubble, and they all said, how quickly can we burst it? I realize that's not necessarily our pet interest here, but these are 10 parents. And so what I've got is a computational model that I've developed of a research university. And I'm going to explain it to you and show you some of the results, show you how I think the bubble's going to burst without predicting the date. And then probably tomorrow, we're going to talk about an experiment where I'm going to give you this model and ask you to take it home and put in the parameters for your university and tell me what insights you gain and whether the model is actually useful to you or not. So let me go on to the first slide. Do I get to advance the slides, or do they? Right there? Okay, so we're going to talk about multi-level models of nature universities, a financial model of a university, the research enterprise, some policy implications. Then we're going to look at 4 scenarios, and I'm going to try to convince you that those 4 scenarios are going to converge and the higher education bubble is going to burst. And so here's my model university. It runs all the way from the social ecosystem down to education, research, and service practices. The rudiments of this model emerged about 1,000 years ago in Bologna. And it is kind of interesting that we have not had to significantly change it in 1,000 years. I once presented this, and there was a historian at UCLA said to me, do you know why there are departments in schools and colleges? She said they had to do that in Bologna to keep the scholars from killing each other because they all wore swords, and they had to separate them. Nowadays, we just limit our weapons to words, but some of that still remains. So this is looking at a university, but actually the system is more like this. And the interesting part about this is right here, because the bottom across these multiple universities, I think John calls them guilds, as I recall. The guilds really control the practices of what counts for promotion, tenure, rewards, what journals matter, what agencies are the prestigious ones to get funding from. So it's an interesting thing where the university, from the vertical point of view, allows its most important processes to be done by other universities. There really aren't any other organizations that operate that way that I'm aware of. So here's my model, and I'm going to show it to you tomorrow morning, the actual linked spreadsheets, but today I want to talk about the implications of it. So we have a dashboard. This has schools, departments, endowment, tuition, and a few other things. From that, we end up having students apply, and students basically apply based on a combination of tuition and brand value. For a research university, people would like to get into the highest brand value university they can that they can afford. And so there's a trade-off. And as you're going to see, if you try to lower tuition, it tends to reduce brand value, and I'll explain exactly how that happens in a minute. The students drive the number of classes and number of faculty. Tenure track and non-tenure track is a big issue. Back in I think the 70s, 80% of faculty in American universities were tenure track. Now it's 30%. Then we have our cost of teaching, research, administration. The research generates articles, citations, H-index for faculty. We get revenue, and it goes into the outputs of the model, and the brand value feeds back. I'll come back and explain brand value in a few minutes. I really exploit John's work in this area. And this is where we run it in a thing called the Immersion Lab that has this 8-foot by 20-foot, 180-degree screens. The one I'm showing you here happens to be a healthcare simulation, but this is the simulation with all of the components of the model of the university. It's been interesting to have deans and provosts and other people in here and show them empirical relationships, because almost everything in the models are driven by data that I've accumulated from various sources. And for these people to be surprised at relationships they never even thought existed, even though they've been running schools and colleges and universities for decades. So here, I'm just going to show you some typical outputs. Here we have just projections of dollars and students. The lower one is the student body, and the top one is the cost per student. Obviously, this all depends on what you make your starting points on the dashboard. So I'm just trying to give you illustrative results here. And then we can project revenue costs and a surplus or deficit. So you can see for this one, the current plan, the university runs a deficit for about 9 years and then starts to run a surplus with that strategy. Now, of course, in reality, the leadership of the university would never get to do this. Actually, in this one, they don't run a deficit, right? They're running a surplus. Now, here comes a big issue, and this is right on building on what John had to say. The research enterprise cannot pay for itself. Okay? Part of it, only part of it, is the fact that the overhead return is not the full cost of overhead in the university, because not everything's allowed. University overhead got really scrutinized a few decades ago when Stanford was charging the president's yacht to the research overhead. And then the federal government started to really pay attention to overhead rates. And so they really got controlled. But that's not the big problem here of why we have to subsidize tuition. The problem is the cost of sales. The cost of developing all the proposals, including the ones that fail. Faculty put an enormous amount of time into creating proposals. And from the university's point of view, that's not accounted for at all. Right? It's just sunk cost. It's just gone. I mean, basically, faculty are viewed as sunk cost, and as a consequence, you can ask them to do anything because their time is infinitely expandable. Here we have the difference between a tenure track faculty being 10%, the black line, versus tenure track faculty being 90%. And so you can see we have to increase tuition by $5,000 per semester, $5,000 per semester, to subsidize the 90% tenure track faculty. So basically what we're doing is we're using student debt to subsidize the research enterprise. I mean, that's the reality of it. And so you get to pay for your professors' research for the next 10 or 20 years. The other way we can do it, though, is endowment. And so here we have the same thing. We just have to increase our endowment by about $1 billion. And then the earnings off the endowment can subsidize the research. Also, you see along the x-axis there, the number of schools and departments. It turns out the administrative costs are pretty high. And as you provide more and more specialties, administrative costs just keep on growing because you're actually paying an administrator to administrate a smaller level of activity as you're slicing and dicing the students more. Now, let's look at the research enterprise and where this is headed. All of this here is data-driven. Here's NIH, this data on the proposal success rate, and I have fit a model to the data. The models are used in the computational model. So you see here we've gone from 35% down to about 18% success rate with NIH. The reason in part is because the money isn't growing anywhere near as fast as the number of proposals. The number of proposals is growing very, very quickly. Here we have the data for NSF. It's down from 35-ish or so, 33-ish, down to 22. Beyond that, what's happened with the money, the average proposal funded by the engineering directorate from the data NSF provided, provides 0.4 of a summer month to the faculty member and less than one student. So beyond the success rate, there's also the funding. Here's Nature. If you want to submit all your articles to Nature, you know, most university presidents, if they had their say, they would have everyone just get NSF money and just publish in Nature. Okay? There's absolutely no way universities can afford that, but they still articulate that value system. And so here's the rate for that. IEEE transactions are better. This is about 50 journals that IEEE gave me data for. But still, we get the problem of the acceptance rate steadily going down for proposals or articles, and the demand steadily going up as more and more universities, not just the 160 John mentioned, more and more try to aspire to the same standards and force faculty to do that. This one is fun. So the model assumes that every faculty member tries to have $100,000 a year of funding. And so they have to generate proposals to get that $100,000 a year funding. You can see as we go out here, the faculty are having to generate more and more proposals. And as a consequence, there's no time left to write articles. In fact, under some of the assumptions that I have in the model, some of the scenarios, the faculty only write proposals. They never do anything else. Obviously, this is not sustainable, right? Now, brand value comes from John's wonderful report. It was a godsend when I found that report because I didn't know how I was going to handle this because it seems kind of vague. I wanted to predict rankings, but brand value is, I made that phrase up as sort of a proxy. But what it is a linear combination across all of your faculty of the number of articles published, the number of citations, and the H-index. And this comes from John's study that shows that that is a pretty good predictor of universities' ranking. And it really goes to the story that basically when you think about a university, how do you rank them? And for 4 years when I was school chair at Georgia Tech, I got to rank universities. And the only way I could figure out how to do it was to think about who's there and what do they do and how good do I think the work is. I mean, I couldn't go on the website and see if they got a climbing wall, right? That was not going to work for me. And so it really makes a lot of intuitive sense besides statistical sense, as John showed. And I can show you with some examples how, as you try to economize and drive down tuition, the easiest way is to go to more non-tenure track faculty. They're cheaper, they don't have long-term commitments. The problem is they don't do research, and so you don't get articles and citations and H-index out of them. And so what happens is if you try to keep the prices down, you end up compromising on the brand value of the university. So let's talk about some policy implications here. Then I want to talk about 4 scenarios. So basically, if you just look at the data, the current success model will require faculty members to work harder and harder to achieve less and less success. Okay? It is just the demand on the resources for funding or for publication are increasing so fast. Most universities have a gold standard, if you will, of NIH and NSF as funding because of the peer review process. But there are many other excellent agencies, the Air Force, the Army, ONR, NASA, others, and really we have to be open to that. I was at a university recently and a young faculty member had not got his NSF grant funded, but a company had heard about his proposal and just gave him the money. And he was afraid to talk to his dean about it, that they would look at this money as somehow tainted. I mean, to me, money is just input, right? Its output is what counts. And so I think that the gold standard of who should be the sponsors is going to have to change. The gold standard of what journals, the A journals, I mean, in some ways it's kind of ridiculous. This is especially true in business schools that are totally driven by the Financial Times. In each area, there's only 3 journals that count. And I know one university, well-known university, if you don't publish in those, they cut your salary. So it is a pretty disincentive. And the whole idea, of course, is to communicate these changes the provost, promotion and tenure committee, faculty in general, because the junior faculty I found have a lot of myths about what really counts and will march to those drummers unless you explicate something different. Now let's look at, on the home stretch on this, let's look at 4 scenarios. So as we look at the future of the university, what's it going to be like? Well, certainly any one-point prediction is going to be wrong, right? There's a range of things that could happen. So I developed these 4 scenarios, which I've used with 2 or 3 universities on some of their planning. So the first one is clash of titans, or business as usual on steroids, that we're used to. We just continually battle to achieve dominance in various academic disciplines and competing for overall rankings. And so we're wondering, you know, what would it take to displace Stanford? Well, first of all, it's not going to happen, but people still think those things could happen. So Clash of Titans is the dominant. Hot, Flat, and Crowded is borrowed from Tom Friedman. We get global parity of universities in graduate education, science, and technology. Consequently, students will not come to the United States in quite as numbers. In fact, if you've seen the paper recently, I don't know if it was the Post or the Times, the last 2 years have been a decline of foreign students coming to the U.S. Part of it is because they got other choices. Part of it is they're so uncertain about the immigration laws that they're not sure if they get here they can get out, or if they're halfway through their degree and they go home, can they ever get back? And so there's a lot of uncertainty. A lifespan Mecca is a growing demand from older students for a new, the second master's degree, the third master's degree as they retread for new jobs. But they're not willing to put up with $50,000 tuitions or dorms and cafeterias, right? They want a different kind of experience. And then, of course, Network U, social technology prevails. Access to the best content and faculty is universal. Everybody takes physics from Richard Feynman and economics from Paul Samuelson. The fact that the newer theories of economics in physics these folks had never heard of won't matter. We can deal with it. Pixar will take care of it. And so students go to college, learn, mature. The classroom experience is now highly interactive, both remotely and face-to-face. And we've heard several things today that would support that. So what happens with these 4 scenarios? So I run them through the model. So we see with Titans, we get population that is roughly what it was to start off with, a small growth and tuition. Hot, Flat, and Crowded, student population drops substantially. Now, because the model automatically resizes the faculty, tuition doesn't have to actually scale as much as it would. With lifespan, we get more students, but still the tuition has to be down. And then with network, we get a huge explosion of students, and tuition goes down. Again, tuition goes down because I'm assuming the university operates on a 0 net present value. It doesn't want to run a surplus or a deficit. It always wants to just cover things. Obviously, it could want to have a surplus, and that would change it a little bit, but not much. Now, the other interesting thing is for the Network U, why not have bigger classes? I'm assuming that the online classes are, in this previous chart, the same size as the in-person classes. But why wouldn't you have larger classes, as we've heard several talks about this today? Well, as you go to 10x, so rather than 20 students, you have 200. Caddy had 2,000. Okay, so you go to 10x, you can basically offer, this is the tuition per semester, you can basically offer a professional master's degree for $8,000 rather than $50,000. And you see Georgia Tech's computer science degree is has gone in that direction, and now their business analytics degree sponsored by Accenture is going to go to that price. It seemed to me that the market is going to be such that when you can get a credential from a top university for $8,000, why would you go someplace else and get it for $50,000? The universities are going to have to cut tuition for these online degrees. Many of them now charge the same, online versus on campus. Prices are going to have to go down. The economics are such that if it doesn't, someone else is going to enter and disrupt the whole thing. So let's talk about the bubble. What's going to happen to this bubble? Well, first of all, in the lower right, we've got the increasing cost of traditional business model. Okay, the increasing cost of research, the increasing need to subsidize it, the increasing administrative costs. Administrative costs have risen about 60% faster than the student body has risen, where research and teaching costs are about the same as the growth in student body. Yep. So the traditional cost, that's going to be a problem. The bubble's going to get bigger. Declining foreign student enrollment, that will happen. It's a question just when it happens. If we make immigration as miserable as possible, we can make it happen faster. The increasing quality of online professional degree programs is going to push on the bubble, and then the increasing demand for continuing education. Now, where will we see the first signs that this is happening? I think it's going to be in the professional master's degrees. These two I mentioned from Georgia Tech, where they're going to offer a professional master's degree for 20% of the normal tuition. Most of the universities that I've been working with, and over the years I actually figured out one day, just for the fun of it, I've actually been involved with 50 universities. The professional master's degrees are a real cash cow. People come in, they get their MBA or whatever, and they pay $50,000, and the cost of delivery is just nowhere near that. Okay? And so the profit margin there is enormous. That's going to be where the bubble starts to leak first, because those are the monies that are being used to subsidize a lot of other things, and those are going to start to leak. Now, what the university is going to have to do is figure out how to offer these professional master's degrees much less expensively. My sense is that the $8,000 or $10,000 that Georgia Tech is charging, for example, you still make money at that. You just can't make these unbelievable margins. And you need those margins to subsidize other things, mainly research, but occasionally football. As I think John had mentioned, there's only a very small number of the 120 Division I schools that actually don't have to subsidize their athletic programs. So I see this as the scenario. I don't know the timing, but you're starting to see glimmers of it already. I talked to our provost a little while ago and said, what would happen if the economics or the political situation got through so that Chinese students could not come to graduate school here? And he said, well, we'd lose $30 million a year. I said, so what would you do then? And he said, well, everybody else would have the problem. And I said, but that's not a plan B, right? Well, I mean, how are you going to compensate for that kind of revenue loss? So anyways, tomorrow morning, I'll actually bring up the model and then show you how you can get a copy if you want it. I would appreciate it if you took it, plugged in the parameters for your university. The 7 linked spreadsheets, each spreadsheet has a dashboard. I mean, you have to even put in like what do you pay the athletic director, which probably varies a lot in different places. Certainly more than the president usually. And I'll show you how I'm going to get you a copy of the book. This came out with 2016 from John Wiley. All of the assertions I made here and everything are all data supported. It's a very, very rich environment, and you'll see several Lombardi references in the book. So, thank you.